It is a complete coincidence, really, that my speech is based on the same topic as the previous one. And by the way, I'd like to congratulate the previous speaker on a very pertinent and wonderfully delivered speech. Or is it a coincidence? Well, I don't know the previous speaker, and we did not agree to do this. Maybe it's the fact that two people who don't know each other chose the same topic. Says a lot about the gravity of recent events concerning the African-American community in the United States. And I think that recent events are really nothing more than the tip of the iceberg. I'm going to focus today, ladies and gentlemen, on Black Lives Matter. You'll have surely seen the hashtag on Twitter. And I'm going to focus in particular on arguments that are critical of Black Lives Matter. And I'm going to be focusing specifically on a rebuttal of some of these criticisms, which I believe are either unjustified or miss the point entirely. But let us start at the beginning and start on May 25th, 2020, Minneapolis, Minnesota. George Floyd was an African-American who was who was in his car when he was stopped by 4 police officers. Floyd was handcuffed and made to lie on the ground. After this happened, Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, proceeded to put his knee on Floyd's neck and keep it there for 6 minutes, whereupon Floyd lost consciousness. Undeterred, Officer Chauvin continued to effectively choke his victim for 3 more minutes. So we all know what happened. George Floyd died, and this sparked massive protests across the United States of America. The police in Minneapolis initially claimed that Floyd was resisting arrest, but this version of the facts was quickly disproved by security camera footage from a local store. And moreover, a number of passers-by also filmed the scene. And they filmed a black man being restrained by 4 police officers, 3 of them Caucasian. As I mentioned before, George Floyd's murder sparked mass protests across the country. New York, Salt Lake City, Philadelphia, even in front of the White House, compelling a certain Mr. Donald Trump to cower in an underground bunker. You talk about you talk about leadership. Now, the slogan that unites these protests and a number of protests in recent years against police brutality perpetrated on minorities all fall under the Black Lives Matter umbrella. But I'm going to focus today on a number of criticisms which are leveled at Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to go through them point by point. And the first criticism that is often leveled at Black Lives Matter is that the message is somehow discriminatory. It's called Black Lives Matter. Why shouldn't it be? Shouldn't it be all lives matter? And in theory, at least, this sounds reasonable. The trouble is, of course, is that in theory, this is a good idea. In practice, it isn't all lives that are under threat. It is Black lives specifically, or at the very least, minority lives. What do I mean? Well, according to mappingpoliceviolence.org, African Americans are 3 times as likely as Caucasian Americans to be killed by law enforcement. Hispanics in the United States are 1.5 times more likely than white people to be killed in the United States of America by law enforcement. It turns out that 8 of the biggest police departments in the United States of America kill African Americans at a higher rate than the murder rate in the United States as a whole. And here's the kicker. Law enforcement agencies in the USA do not keep an official tally of the people they kill, white, black, Asian, or whatever. And this leads us to our second criticism that is often made about Black Lives Matter. Hey, why don't you join Blue Lives Matter? Also a hashtag you'll find on Twitter and on social media. Again, Blue Lives Matter, solidarity with the police is a good principle because there are many police officers with good intentions out there. But the problem is that there are many others who do not. And a slew of killings in recent years, many aimed at African Americans, should really convince you of this. And the problem there with Officer Chauvin, who I introduced at the beginning of this speech, was that he was accompanied by 3 officers. One of them was Asian American, and none of them did anything to stop him killing George Floyd. Again, according to mappingpoliceviolence.org, law enforcement officers in the United States killed 1,099 people in 2019, whether justifiably or unjustifiably. I'm not going to go into those details. But according to the FBI, in the same year, 89 police officers died in the line of duty. That's quite a discrepancy. I'm going to go on about Officer Chauvin and remind you that even before killing George Floyd, he had been the subject of 18 complaints of racism. 18. That's quite a lot. On social media, Officer Chauvin posted a picture of himself with a Make America White Again hat. Not Make America Great Again, which is alarming enough, but Make America White Again. Had he been a civilian, people would have called him an extremist. But wearing the policeman's uniform seems to wash away his sins. He has since been arrested and is awaiting trial. Now, a third criticism that is often made of Black Lives Matter is, why are African Americans rioting? Why are they looting? Why are they angry? Soon after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, a Target store, part of a major American chain, was looted in the city. And this led many people to say, don't loot, don't riot. This isn't the right form of protest. But I say to them, is this what you focus on as opposed to the death of a fellow human being? Not that this should matter, but George Floyd was an upstanding member of his community. He did absolutely nothing wrong and was killed for it. But let us look at the context of rioting and looting. When else have African Americans rioted and looted in the past? Well, they did so in 1991 in Los Angeles. But that was because Rodney King, an African American, was beaten to within an inch of his life by American police. Why do you think African Americans rioted and looted in St. Louis in 2016? Well, that was because in Ferguson, Missouri, an African American called Michael Brown was shot in the back by a white police officer. Michael Brown, unlike Rodney King, did not live to tell the tale. Why do you think African Americans rioted in Baltimore, Maryland in 2015? I think you've worked out the pattern by now. It was because Freddie Gray, an African American, was in police custody, yet somehow sustained injuries to his neck and to his spine. I'd also like to point out that saying not the right form of protest puts you on the same boat as those who pointed the finger at Martin Luther King 40 or well, actually longer than that, it will be 60 years ago. Martin Luther King, the father of the American Civil Rights Movement, probably the father of nonviolence along with Mahatma Gandhi. Even back then, he was accused of not protesting the right way. If people are resorting to rioting and looting, it is also because many other forms of nonviolent protest have not worked. And anyway, we need to look at looting and rioting in a context. After all, looting and rioting accompanied the French Revolution, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa. We need to look at a bigger picture. Now, the fourth and perhaps most disconcerting criticism that is leveled at Black Lives Matter is that it is a terrorist or extremist organization, which is rather surprising, seeing as Black Lives Matter has not been responsible for any deaths since its inception. On the other hand, far-right terrorism has killed 107 people in the USA as of 2002. So that's more victims than those killed by jihadists after 9/11. Far-right terrorism really is the hot topic. And yet people seem to somehow come up with this false equivalence of Black Lives Matter on the one hand and the far-right on the other. People seem to do this very often. An example is when Donald Trump, once again, said that there were good people on both sides at the Unite the Right march in Charlottesville, Virginia, a march which took place on August 11th and 12th of 2017. Good people on both sides. Well, let's look at both sides. On the one hand, you had non-violent citizens, African Americans, many civil societies, and they were protesting the presence of Confederate statues. They represent the Confederacy, in other words, symbols of racism and hatred. So there were good people on that side. But there were also good people on the other side. And we go and look at them and we find, oh dear, the Ku Klux Klan, thousands of white nationalists, and even people who were part of downright fascist organizations. Many of them paraded at night, brandishing torches. It looked like 1930s Germany. There were good people there too, apparently. Good people in the crowd that almost beat an African American to death, his name DeAndre Harris, in a scene which resembled a lynching. There were good people also, I imagine, in that car, which ran over some non-violent protesters and killed one of them. The man driving that car has since been sentenced to life in prison. And yet it's quite strange that in America, the authorities don't seem to have their priorities quite straight. In 2017, after Charlottesville, the FBI said they were monitoring Black identity extremists. If they were looking more carefully at the kill counts, they would perhaps change their priorities. We can think of one example of a crime being perpetrated from white supremacists, and that is the slew of killings carried out by Dylann in 2015. On June the 7th, he entered a church, mostly attended by African Americans in South Carolina, and proceeded to shoot 9 people. They all died. He later said that he was hoping to ignite a race war. In conclusion then, ladies and gentlemen, these criticisms of Black Lives Matter do seem justified, but this is only on the surface. They do not tackle the deep-rooted systemic issues that are behind a lot of these protests. And in effect, by attacking Black Lives Matter in the ways that I have outlined here, really shows an ignorance of why people protest, why people riot, and why people loot. People really wouldn't be protesting like that if Black lives really did matter. I guess we can ask the question, do Black lives matter right now in the USA? And the answer would be, well, if Black lives mattered, children wouldn't be shot for walking around with toy guns, which is what happened to Tamir, a 10-year-old in Cleveland a few years ago. He didn't live to tell the tale either. If Black lives mattered, African Americans would not live in perpetual fear of the police. If Black lives mattered, African Americans would not be driven to riot, to protest, to loot by constant systemic discrimination and by police brutality. The truth, in conclusion, is perhaps closer to what Cleveland, an African American character from Family Guy, once said. He said that Black people, they don't really win. They just do a little better each time. Thank you.